occurrence. In any case, it was clear by the end of 1941 that RAF Bomber Command, if it were going to continue to play any kind of meaningful strategic role in the air war over Germany and over occupied Europe, was going to have to come up with some kind of alternative to the precision attacks which it had been attempting hitherto. And there was really one obvious solution, which was to switch from precision strategic attacks to what were referred to as area strategic attacks, or what some have in more recent times referred to as carpet bombing. Although this really wasn't the expression that was used at the time. It was referred to as area bombing, which was simply a euphemism for bombing an entire city or locality rather than aiming for particular targets within a city or locality. And area bombing, after about the middle of 1942, was facilitated by a series of technological developments and improvements. One of the most important was the introduction of reliable, serviceable four-engine bombers into RAF inventory. One of the most notable of these was the Lancaster bomber, which you see illustrated on the right-hand side. And of course, those of you who live in southern Ontario or around the Hamilton area have probably seen at one time or another the Lancaster bomber, which is held in the collection of the Aviation Museum in Hamilton, which is one of, I think, only two Lancaster bombers left in the world that is in flying condition. Not to go too far off track here, but years ago there was a Lancaster bomber on static exhibit near the exhibition grounds on Lakeshore Boulevard in Toronto. And I think about 10 or 12 years ago, maybe more, that aircraft was removed to Downsview, to one of the hangars up in Downsview in North Toronto, and is undergoing, or at least was undergoing, restoration with long-term plans to rebuild another airworthy Lancaster bomber. But the reason the Lancaster was important was because it was a reliable aircraft and it was capable of managing a bomb load of up to 10 tons, which dwarfed anything that had been possible in the First World War, where even carrying a 1-ton bomb would have been considered pushing the envelope. And now we have the Lancaster bomber that can carry 10 tons, or something like 20,000 pounds worth of bombs, which, to give you a rough idea, 20,000 pounds of bombs is the equivalent of about 10 compact cars in weight. So it's a lot of ordnance. Another important development, and this is a more complex topic that I won't delve too far into, was the introduction of electronic navigational aids. Examples are in British service are G or oboe. The Germans had already been using electronic navigation aids rather earlier in the war, and the British, when they discovered this, had to develop their own countermeasures. I can't get into the technological complexities of how these navigational aids worked, but essentially they were based on the use of radio beacons. What I'm going to do is provide you a link to an excellent documentary. It's an older documentary, but a very good one, that describes in explicit and understandable detail exactly how these electronic navigational aids worked, in particular the early German navigational aids that were used over Britain in the opening stages of the war. The RAF also turned to the use of highly capable Pathfinder squadrons, whose job was to guide the main bomber force over the target. And these squadrons used specialized aircraft, such as the de Havilland Mosquito, to drop markers, flares, or incendiary devices over the target area to show the way to the target area for the bomber streams which followed. So some of the best pilots and navigators would have been concentrated into the Pathfinder squadrons in order to uh, minimize the chances that bombers would get lost or end up bombing the wrong place. And in contrast to the German bombing attacks during the Blitz over Britain in 1940 and 1941, the RAF was simply able to concentrate more aircraft per attack, so that more damage was done. And for example, the first episode or the first operation where we have 1,000 bombers participating in a single raid took place over the city of Cologne in western Germany in May of 1942. And it's not surprising that cities like Cologne and other cities in western Germany that were within relatively easy range of RAF attacks, by the end of the war, were almost completely destroyed because of these ongoing heavy raids involving many hundreds or even 1,000 aircraft in a single evening. Another relatively simple technological measure that the RAF and later the American Air Force also used was window or chaff, I guess is probably the right way to pronounce that. And all that this consisted of were bundles of aluminum foil, much like the aluminum foil that you might have in the drawer in your kitchen. And these huge bundles of foil that were released over the skies of Germany because of their metallic properties, tended to confuse German radar operators, or to blind the radar screens of German radar operators who were trying to figure out where the actual bombing attacks might be coming. And this was a relatively effective counter radar measure, which was in use from 1943 onward. Just before we go on, it's worth pointing out some of the cultural dimensions of the Bomber War. And here's just one example in the lower right photograph, where you see a typical example of the nose art, which was often applied to the fuselages of RAF aircraft, and the U.S. Army Air Force also tended to mark their planes with lots of nose art, and the subject matter of the nose art varied from one bomber crew to the next, but as Vicky the Vicious Virgin indicates, one popular motif was the so-called pin-up girl, which was typical of calendars that soldiers and airmen would usually have hanging in their quarters. And another motif was Disney cartoons, Mickey Mouse, Popeye, that kind of thing. These were often incorporated into nose art. The photograph that you see here of Vicky was actually taken by my mother's father, who was an aircraft mechanic in the RCAF, the Royal Canadian Air Force, during the war, and he worked on Mosquitoes and Lancasters and other familiar models of airplane. So as of 1943, or even the second half of 1942, it would be fair to say that the strategic bombing campaign against Germany and German-occupied Europe was one of the centerpieces of Western Allied strategy. Because as of 1943, it wasn't any longer just the Royal Air Force that was engaged in this campaign, but also the U.S. Army Air Force, which had gradually built up in Britain during the course of 1942, and by 1943 was capable of also mounting large raids against targets in Germany and occupied Europe, using a range of different types of aircraft, the most important of which was probably the four-engined B-17. If anybody's seen the film Memphis Belle, which is probably over 20 years old now, then you're familiar with that aircraft. So until the Allies had built up enough strength as far as ground forces were concerned in Great Britain that they could then use to launch an invasion of Northwest Europe, which would have a reasonable chance of success, the decision was made to continue keeping up the pressure against Germany and German-occupied Europe through strategic bombing. And we know that as of 1942, RAF Bomber Command was increasingly focused on area bombing rather than precision bombing, because precision bombing just wasn't yielding the results that had been hoped for, and much more damage could be done just through a general area bombing approach without as many concerns about trying to find this or that specific target. So once the Americans were involved in the campaign, the general approach was that RAF Bomber Command would continue to operate over Europe at nighttime, and the U.S. Army Air Force would operate during the daytime. They would mount daylight raids, and the reason that the Americans were intent on daylight attacks was because even after the RAF had abandoned precision bombing, the U.S. Army Air Force continued to pursue precision bombing and felt that they had the best chance of success making these attacks during the day, when navigational problems would be less acute, and when target areas would simply be easier to find. Now, bombing during the day was more hazardous, and certainly accounted for many of the losses that the American bomber formations suffered as a consequence of interception by German fighter aircraft. But to a degree, this disadvantage was mitigated by operating at higher altitude, which at least limited the impact of anti-aircraft fire, ground-based anti-aircraft fire, against the American bomber formations. Now, again, we haven't got the time to get into a month-by-month analysis of how these operations played out. I'll leave you with the Parker textbook for that further detail. But what we do need to ask is exactly what impact these campaigns had, and whether or not the benefits to Allied strategy justified the costs. And we may also dare to ask about some of the ethical considerations which invariably come up when one considers a blunt strategy like area bombing, where all civilians are basically fair game, and where civilian casualties can easily become quite high. So beginning first, at least, with some of the practicalities, I turn back to a statement from the interwar period that was made by one of the interwar British Prime Ministers, Stanley Baldwin, and in a particular speech where Stanley Baldwin was making reference to the future potential of aerial warfare. He made the statement that that in the next big war, the bomber would always be able to get through and threaten the home front in a war effort. And this has become sort of a famous catchphrase, that the bomber would always get through. The reality was that during the Second World War, in the event, the bomber did not always get through. That bombing strategies came with, generally speaking, a rather higher cost than interwar advocates of strategic bombing had imagined that it would. So to take RAF Bomber Command as an example, and remember RAF Bomber Command